What is up, everybody? Welcome to Elasmocast. Now, today we have a special guest, Russell Engelman, who has been making headway recently with his publications relating to Dunkleosteus. We're usually a Chondrichthyan related podcast, and we will get to the sharky stuff. But first, we're going to start off talking about Dunkleosteus because you're the man for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Dunkleosteus has, been making headway in the last couple years based on new interpretations of what this animal looked like and its size. It used to be considered, the biggest, baddest animal of the Devonian and arguably even within the Paleozoic, with a lot of depictions such as the Chased by Dinosaurs series that they did with Nigel Marvin. And that's how I got into Dunkleosteus. It was one of my favorite animals as a kid. And now it turns out that it didn't really look like that, did it?
No, not really. The Chase by Dinosaurs depiction, it got a lot of people interested in Dunkleosteus, but it also created a lot of issues with misinformation.
And what misinformation was present in that film?
For one, so the depiction of like the regurgitating Dunkleosteus is one good example of this. So if you read if you watch the documentary and you read the associated depictions, it'll often claim that, oh, Dunkleosteus regurgitates these pellets containing fish bones, and these are common fossils in the Cleveland Shale, and these are they aren't. Like I actually
Mm.
I when I started doing research on Arthrodires, I took this at face value. I went into the collections of the Cleveland Museum looking for these things. And
hmm
I asked the collections managers and the curators, like, hey, like, where do you keep the fish pellets, the Dunkleosteus vomit? And they're like, what? And I said, well, yeah, it's like we don't have any of that.
Wow.
And so I looked everywhere and I looked and looked and looked. I ended up, this became like my personal white whale to the point that I got my old CD of sea monsters, pulled out a CD-ROM, put it in there, fast forwarded to the credits, and wrote down the names of every single person who they asked for advice on, and then went through the list and figured out who could have possibly given them the information that led to this. And that's how I actually managed to track down where it came from.
hmm And where did it come from?
Well, so hang on, I'm just thinking here. So I did try emailing Impossible Pictures several times to try to figure out because obviously the question would be just ask them because maybe they got it from somewhere else and I've gotten no response. It turns out that the best I can tell, there was a geologist, Marilyn Wegweiser, who was doing she's a stratigrapher, and she was
hmm
doing stratigraphic work in the Cleveland Shale exposures in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And this was the only person they could have interviewed that had any expertise in the Devonian at all. It's very strange because all the other segments had at least one person who would be, even today, recognized as a major expert in that field.
hmm
There was nobody who was like a placoderm expert on that thing. So I reached out to Dr. Wegweiser and she said, oh, yeah, I remember this. I remember talking to the BBC. And she actually remembered exactly what she told them that probably led to this, which was she found was probably it's a Chondrichthyan regurgitolite from something like Cladosolaki that was about the size or volume of a coffee mug. And she told them about that. They got stars in their eyes and then extrapolated this up to Dunkleosteus. Now
Interesting.
it's very possible that there's like one record out there that this one researcher shrugged his shoulders and said, well, maybe this is fossil vomit. But to be honest, it doesn't really look like I mean, you're a shark guy. You know that there's a number of these shark regurgitolites published around. Like there's some from the Mesozoic, there's some from the Paleozoic, but like there's like they have a distinct look to them.
Yeah.
They have an organic ground mass, they have a bunch of bones embedded in them. They look like vomit that someone stuck between two layers of shell, and this doesn't really look like that. And yeah, that's probably what produces depiction. And the big problem comes in is that Paleozoic animals don't get a lot of traction in media, and and there's not like this idea of in Paleozoic paleontology of we need to be cognizant about how we're showing our study groups to the general public and what ideas are taken away from it.
Hmm.
And it's this thing. I went and I interviewed a bunch of people at SVP saying, "Have you heard of this?" Anyone who worked on tetrapods said, "Oh yes, I've heard of this," and then they freaked out when I mentioned I can't there seems to be no data on this. There's no publication I can track this back to. There's no anything. Whereas the fish researchers and the ones who I say fish researchers, but I also talk to like people who work on Devonian faunas in general. None of them had ever heard of this. They actually said, "Oh, do you have one? You should describe it. That would be a great fossil." It's like, yeah, but that's the problem. They don't exist. As far as I can tell, they don't exist.
That's really crazy that something that's in mass media could kind of throw all paleontologists in a loop where they don't realize that they just assume that some other paleontologist must have known about this, but they never heard and they never actually went to delve into it really until you, it sounds
Yeah.
like.
And the only reason I did is I came into fish paleontology from tetrapod paleontology. I mean, I grew up as a dino nerd. I grew up like a lot of paleontologists nowadays with the walking with dinosaurs stuff. And as a result, I was more familiar with that. I was familiar with that, whereas people who maybe were interested in fishes from day one may not have seen that.
Hmm.
And that's what got me to go look for it. And many people probably wouldn't have even tried looking for it.
Yeah. Well, Dunkleosteus, at least in the mainstream media, was kind of that bridge between like the mainstreamness of dinosaurs. I mean, it obviously never reached that, but it
Oh,
was still an animal that wound up becoming almost like a cult classic
it does.
amongst enthusiasts.
I often talk about Dunkleosteus. I describe it as a quote honorary dinosaur. Like actually, oh shoot, I have this on my phone. I don't have this. Let me see if I can find this. So it's like Mario Kart with
Mhm.
prehistoric animals. There's 15 of them here, and of course it's the same 15 you see everywhere. And looking at it, the only non-tetrapods on this chart are Anomalocaris and Dunkleosteus. And I mean, that is like the perfect example of, yeah, honorary dinosaur.
Mhm. Yeah, and it really bewilders the fascinations of especially young people getting into this because here you have an animal that is significantly older than the dinosaurs yet was still, highlighted as like the king of the seas. It had this big giant armored skull, and you had those like plated, teeth like things that would just like chomp into things like in Chased by Dinosaurs. And that's really what got me into like Paleozoic stuff, period. Like the depictions of Dunkleosteus and Stegocanthus. Those were like the things that got me fascinated into Paleozoic stuff in the first place.
Oh yeah, I don't think you're the only one. I think a lot of people have explicitly said that Dunkleosteus is specifically the gateway drug to get them into the Paleozoic. So Matt Friedman, who is a big for your listeners who may not be aware, he is probably one of the top paleoichthyologists in the world, and he recently won some big prestigious award for being a paleoichthyologist. And he explicitly says in his acceptance of the award that he was inspired to go into fossil fishes because of Dunkleosteus. So. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people have said that.
Hmm. Yeah, so we know of Dunkleosteus as mostly just, the cranial elements and you said like the girdles and things like that.
Well, and that so just to catch you right there, and I'm saying this because this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions I see about Dunkleosteus. This is something that is so commonly regarded among placoderm workers that like when I put this in my recent paper, I had people saying like, "Why are you saying this? This is common knowledge. This isn't even worth mentioning in a paper."
Mhm.
But then when I mention it to anyone who's not a placoderm worker, they're like, "Oh my God, this is like, oh my, what is this? My entire worldview's upside down." So when you look at the armor of a placoderm, they often say, "Oh, that's the head." It's not the head. It's there's the head ends at this ball and socket joint that is roughly at the level between the head and neck boundary.
Mhm.
It's roughly equivalent to in sharks. It's at the about the same level as like the fifth gill arch. So it's the end of the head and
Mhm.
almost where the pectoral fins start. And then all the plates behind that are the trunk armor, and those are homologous in many ways to the shoulder girdle. Um, Like for example, there's this big L-shaped plate in most of these species called the anterior lateral plate.
Hmm.
That's the clithrum. That is, if any of your listeners know about anything with like lower vertebrate morphology, like fish, like amphibians, like that's basically the collarbone. That's not the collarbone. There's another bone there that is the collarbone, which is the interlateral, which is right here. The clithrum is a bone that would go across up here. It's just that in like mammals and I think probably a lot of the like archosaurs and a lot of the reptiles they've lost that. But like if
Hmm.
you look at a fish skeleton, the clithrum is right there. It's huge and it's the one people think of when they think of a collarbone. There's other bones that are like they're not necessarily I like we don't have them because we've lost a lot of our shoulder girdle bones. But if you look at like fish bones, you say, oh yeah, that goes there and that goes there and that goes there. And this isn't a controversial opinion. Like this is something that's been said by placoderm workers for a long time that the trunk armor is homologous with bones of the shoulder girdle and such. I've seen mentions in Johansson 2003 that explicitly say this and refer to older work that suggests this homology. Ju et al. 2013, the Intellignathus paper, basically went through all the plates of the placoderms and like listed the most likely homologies with each. And these are things that really haven't been challenged in much of a way.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's
and so,
something. Oh, I was just gonna say, and it is something that a lot of people don't really take into account. Like when they see the big cranial elements of Dunkleosteus, they assume that the entire thing is its skull, but then you
right.
have a significant portion of it is extending well past its skull.
Oh yeah. And that's so this is something that like if you look at depictions of Cacossteus, it's like Cacossteus is a smaller, more complete relative of Dunkleosteus. It's clear it extends much farther back.
Hmm.
Um, and so like just looking at these things, they are pretty clear to begin with. But the big another big thing that came up that really hammered this home was in 2022 they discovered preserved organ traces in Arthrodires. And all the basically the trunk armor is in a very loose sense equivalent to the rib cage in other animals. It's not homologous, but it serves a similar function in enclosing and protecting the organs and preventing them from getting hit with things. Because non-bony fish don't have ribs. Sharks don't really have ribs. This is like an alternative solution that does something similar. And they found most of the gut cavity, and they found traces of the anus, and like it's all within the armor. And they found like in other arthrodires, other than these ones from Australia, they were looking at like I've looked at some of the literature, and there are like gut contents in arthrodires from Russia, and there's some from Scotland, and in all of them, the gut contents are within the trunk armor. They're not like halfway off the trunk armor. They're not like floating off into nowhere. They're like the body the tail starts really close to the end of the trunk armor, and everything we have somewhat decent remains for.
Hmm. And let's kind of rewind a little bit. So what exactly was Dunkleosteus? For those
So,
for those that don't know anything about this animal.
right. So Dunkleosteus is what they call an Arthrodire placoderm. To break that down, more specifically, it's a eubrachythoracid Arthrodire placoderm, and all three of those are important, and I'll get to those starting from last to first. The placoderms specifically are a group of uh, fish. They are jawed fish at the very base of the jawed fish family tree. Basically, if you go past placoderms, you're getting into things like lampreys and armored jawless fishes from the Silurian and that those kind of things. Um, they used to be thought to be a monophyletic group, like a single group, but now it's kind of thought that there are a bunch of different separate lineages that like they're united by not by having jaws, by having pelvic fins, by having, but they also like lack things like enamel covered teeth. And in some ways, it looks like certain arthrodires are more closely related to like sharks and bony fishes as a group rather than like a single monophyletic armored branch.
Mhm.
Like for example, consistently we get results suggesting that like Dunkleosteus as an arthrodire is more closely related to living jawed vertebrates than some of these some of these placoderms like Bothria which is an antiarch. They look like crab tadpoles are. Also, like there's these group called the maxillate placoderms, which they think are more closely related to jawed vertebrates than Dunkleosteus is. There's a whole bunch of things there, but it's a paraphyletic stem group of a bunch of things defined by having jaws, but not really having the features of like modern jawed vertebrates. Um, so within that, there are like 4 to 5 groups we think are natural monophyletic groups, and Arthrodira is one of these. Arthrodires are a group of fishes that are defined by having a very well developed articulation for the between the head and the neck. So all these placoderms have armor. All of these placoderms have a head and they have a trunk armor. Oftentimes they don't have a very complex joint between the two. It's often there's some that have sliding joints, there's some that have like not super complex joints, but in arthrodires, especially the later ones, they have a very complex ball and socket joint that almost resembles a door handle or an elbow joint. And there's 2 of them horizontally oriented, basically right where the head meets the trunk armor. And what this allows it to do is it lets the head move more. It basically gives it a wider gape and more motion while also keeping that area stable. And there's a bunch of different arthrodires. A lot of people don't know about most of the arthrodires because they don't really make headlines. Most of the arthrodires are kind of bottom-dwelling fish. They don't have big bitey mouth parts. Most of the mouth parts are mostly cartilage, it turns out, in this group. But there's this one branch of them that branches off from this bottom dwelling, mostly detritivorous, mostly like things you'd think of in benthic fish's way of life, and evolves into a group of nectonic organisms. And because it turns out this works really well, they radiate like crazy and they diversify to a huge variety of forms. And this is the group that we call the Eubrachythoraci. This is the group that the common name for this group is basically Dunkleosteus and friends. This is the group that includes Dunkleosteus. This is the group that includes Coccosteus. If you've been paying attention to the news, this is also the group that includes Amazicthes and Alien, which are the 2 placoderms that kind of made news in the last 2 years or 2 or 3 years.
Mhm.
So when most people talk about arthrodires, they're thinking about Eubrachythoracids. The other group, the rest of the group is very interesting. It's just it doesn't get as much attention and there's not as much work being done on them for a number of reasons.
And with Dunkleosteus, would you consider would you consider to have true teeth, or are those just like plates that are within its armor itself?
So that's actually a complicated question. So this is another common misconception about placoderms. It turns out that at the very least, arthrodires probably did have true teeth. We have jaw plates for a number of these things. And let me get this up because this is one I know I can get up. Also related to this, there's a figure in my new paper that shows the phylogeny of arthrodires relative to other things that might be useful for this. Here we go. So this is something, yeah. So Dunkleosteus, again, people think of Dunkleosteus as the quintessential arthrodire, and it's really not. It's very specialized, even within the context of this limited group of Eubrachythoraci, it's very specialized in a very large number of ways, and it's very funky. So a lot of these arthrodires, their jaw parts have teeth, but the teeth don't function quite like you'd think of in a shark or a fish. Actually, the things that it functions the most similar to are like chameleons and these Triassic things called rhynchosaurs. So these arthrodires, they have teeth, but the teeth don't have roots, they don't have enamel, and they are apparently, as far as we can tell, they're fully fused into the jaw. This would be called an acrodont dentition if you were a reptile worker. Um, and we can tell this because they've done synchrotron scanning of these jaws, and one of the consistent things they find is really strange. So these tooth-like denticles have pulp cavities, and
Hmm.
like this paper shows it, but like I've seen it myself in some of these specimens. There's a form from the Cleveland shale called Diplognathus. It's Let me stop sharing. I will pull up Diplognathus. Let me see if I got a good picture of Diplognathus because I may not. So this is Diplognathus. This is an arthrodire known from the Cleveland Shale. Actually, no, it's not from the Cleveland Shale. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It is from the Huron Shale, and it is only found in the Huron Shale, and you never ever find it in the Cleveland Shale. Um, the best we can tell, this is like the arthrodire equivalent of a barracuda, maybe, or maybe like a northern pike or something. Which those two are very different, but it has this very strange jaw with these very large projections on the lower jaw. And there's only a couple specimens, but somewhere way back when, somebody must have broken some of the teeth on these because they mentioned in these very old papers these teeth are hollow. They have pulp cavities. And that, along with other features, suggests that, yeah, these are probably homologous in some way to the teeth of other vertebrates. But what's funny is, so like 95% of these eubrachiothoracid arthrodires have teeth, and a lot of them have very prominent teeth. Dunkleosteus basically doesn't have any. It has secondarily lost almost every single tooth in its jaws. Um, there's a number of these like tooth rows that run across the naphthol plates of arthrodires. There are some that are on the lower jaw that form like biting surfaces, like you expect to see in a shark. There's some in the upper jaws. There's actually multiple rows sometimes that kind of go past each other, and it's really weird in the some of the upper jaws. There's some that run along the sides of the fangs in the upper jaws. There are actually some, there are some on the very back of the lower jaw that kind of point inward. And then there is a set of teeth in almost every other species you see at the jaw symphysis that point directly inward straight towards each other. And we have no idea what they do. Like every arthrodire, every eubrachiothoracid arthrodire has very, very prominent symphysial teeth, and we don't know what they do. And Dunkleosteus, for some reason, is like one of a very small number of taxa that does not have this feature. So we get some vestigial teeth at the very back of the jaw plates that probably don't serve much of a function. But other than that, yeah, Dunkleosteus kind of doesn't have teeth, but it's not typical for the group.
Hmm. It's interesting. Yeah, because a lot of people think that those jaw plates are teeth, but it's more like it has a tooth-like function.
So this is exactly what I mean. This is a study that I think was published in Journal of Anatomy. It's Dosa de Lova et al. 2016, and they looked at wear patterns in chameleon jaws. And so chameleons start out, the teeth are basically they basically start off as separate structures, but they fuse into the jaw. And this is something that occurs again. It's in rhynchosaurs. It's in this group. It's in this broader group of lizards that chameleons occur in, and also occurs in arthrodires. What happens is the teeth end up wearing against each other, and they start out having teeth, but the teeth are never replaced and they never regrow. So this is not like a shark at all. What happens is, as time goes on, the teeth wear down, and then the bone starts wearing against each other, and that's how you get these famous naphthol blades. Is you start out with teeth, and the teeth are ground down, and the grinding just keeps going and going and going until the bone is wearing against bone, and the bone itself is being reshaped into a blade. And so in this study I was on 2023, like they actually found that there seemed to be some underlying histological changes that are going on. We were looking at Dunkleosteus. I have no idea if it's going on in like these other arthrodires that have prominent blades, or there are some that actually change their dentition through age from having like prominent teeth to having just blades. But the very tips of the blades seem to be very reinforced. They have almost no bone canals. They're basically thickening the bone there so it doesn't bleed every time they bite something. It's a very strange adaptation. When I talked to one of my anatomy professors about this, and he had like 30 different questions on how this mechanism even works. He's like, well, like, why isn't the periosteum getting damaged? Like, why aren't they bleeding every time they bite something? What do they do about nerve endings? And I kept telling him, like, we don't know. Like, I guess maybe now I'd say go look at lizards, but, we still don't know. I would say go look at rhynchosaurs, but they don't help because they're extinct.
Mm-hmm. Now you are known as the man that shrunk the dunk. So in let's talk about your 2023 work
Sure.
and then we'll get on to your more recent at time of like as of time of filming
Right.
work after that too. But let's start with your 2023 findings on Dunkleosteus. So why is Dunkleosteus small now?
Well, so basically, and I've told this story a couple times, but just for recap, basically in the winter of 2021, my research had been on mammals up till then, but I'm from Cleveland. I've lived with Dunkleosteus for 32 years of my life. So it was winter 2021. Um, it was I'm pretty sure it was well into COVID. And I was kind of bored. We couldn't get, so my lab group didn't have access to our usual fossil sites because our lab works on South American mammals, which they're very interesting, but they're also in South America. And if the whole world is shut down due to COVID and the museums are shut down due to COVID, that severely limits what you can do. So I just decided, well, heck with it. I have an interest in these placoderms due to personal projects I've been working on. And I'm going to go across the street from Case to Cleveland Museum, and I'm going to talk to I had an idea for a specific project I wanted to do, which I still want to get out. Um, so I was going to take a look at certain features in Arthrodires for this project, and I did this. And originally, what I was going to do is I was planning to publish like a couple short notes just to publish on something other than mammals and diversify my research portfolio. And one of the things the thing I really wanted to do is I had some research ideas looking at eye morphology in arthrodires. I had a bunch of thoughts on that, and I wanted to look into that. Um, so what happened is if you're studying eye size, you have to scale eye size by some measurement of body size, and it has to be somewhat accurate because otherwise you get nonsensical numbers that make no sense. So what I started out doing is I tried scaling eye size by a couple of different anatomical measurements, and I got nonsensical numbers that made no sense. Um, and apparently I'm not the only one because when I published my initial research, I had at least two different other researchers come up to me and say, like, thank you for publishing this because we were running into huge issues trying to model anything with Dunkleosteus because we were using like the old size estimates and they made no sense. And like one colleague, she was telling me that she was basically trying to replicate some of the old length and weight estimates, but like it was requiring like densities of balsa wood or something. I don't remember the exact like the two measurements could not be reasonable based on what was reported in the literature. Um, so the trying to think. So the thing is, it was very clear that there was something wrong, and I hadn't. My assumption when I went in, because this is Dunkleosteus, is that Dunkleosteus had been studied to death. That's pretty much what everyone assumed. I've been told this by other colleagues. And so I had thought, well, like I'm actually, in terms of arthrodires, Dunkleosteus isn't even the one I'm the most interested in. And I'm interested in this other group called they're the macropredatory spinothoracidans, which you don't hear about them, but I find them far more interesting and to study than Dunkleosteus because they're just less is known about them.
Mhm.
Um, so the problem is that in the Cleveland Shale, Dunkleosteus is by far the most abundant arthrodire. It's a big animal. Its plates are very obvious. And when you're looking for chunks of black bone and black shale to try to figure out if there's a fish skeleton sticking out of the rock, of course you're going to see the big, heavy set animal that preserves well and is easy to recognize. And so what happened is it turned out, yeah, this didn't work. So I had to go back to basics and basically figure out why this didn't work. And one of the things that this required was I had to figure out some way to estimate body size. Um, like I tried doing some stuff using the traditional methods and it just didn't work. Eh, And the more I dug into it, the worse it got. The first thing I found, one of the first things I found out was that like the traditional length estimates for Dunkleosteus were like outright impossible given the dimensions of the fossils. Like some of these specimens were given estimated lengths of almost 7 meters, but the head is only 61 centimeters long, which would require like a head to body proportion, similar, like it's beyond eels and getting into oarfish territory. Um, People have proposed shorter lengths for the same specimens of like, oh, it could be 6 meters long. That still requires a head that's like it's a head to body ratio of 1 to 8. That's the same ratio as like a moray or an American eel. Like we have no evidence of an animal this elongate, and on top of that, like it's very unlikely an animal this eel-like is going to be existing in the Cleveland Shale, which we know from sedimentological evidence is basically completely inhospitable to bottom-dwelling life. Basically, when you think of the Cleveland Shale, imagine an ecosystem where there's the coastline is miles and miles away, and everything on the ocean floor is toxic and uninhabitable. And we see this in the fish fauna. Like everything we find decent remains for the Cleveland Shale is a good swimming animal. Like if you took the fauna list of the Cleveland Shale and you compared it to like a modern ocean fauna, or you compared it to like something in the Mesozoic, which like take like the Western Interior Seaway, there would be a lot of similarities in terms of functionality. And that's the thing. So it's probably not an eel. Um, so the question is, so what happened with me was I had a paper completely a collaboration completely fall apart because we were trying to use the old methods and they just didn't work. And so we said, yeah, we it's not working. And what I did is I ended up trying to look into, well, what other ways are there? And I said, well, screw it. Let's just see if head length works. Like let's see if head length gives us a more reliable measurement than body length or than jaw perimeter. So
Hmm.
jaw perimeter was the method that was claimed to be used in the previous paper. There's some caveats to that. I'll get into that in a sec. So I tried head length and I said, well, that is a weird looking number compared to the previous estimates. Well, maybe it's just that like Arthrodires have super tiny heads and maybe like they're just weird and I'll just grab Cacosteus and a few others and plot them out and see. It's like, nope, they have basic ordinary fish head body proportions. Fish in general, it turns out almost all fish that are not eel-like have head body proportions that are 1 to 4 and 1 to 6. And if you take the placoderms we have complete body plans for, they pretty much all fall within that number. And it's like, well, crap. It turns out that like, these mouth measurements that I was using weren't working, and it turns out no, but head length actually is a much better proxy. So what I did is I went back into the literature and said, well, what's going on? Why does this differ from previous length estimates? And it turns out that with the exception of a study in 2017, who actually mentioned what I'm about to say as well, um, none of the previous size estimates for Dunkleosteus, with one exception, are replicable. They do not mention what measurement they used to estimate the size of Dunkleosteus. Like they didn't say, well, we used lower jaw length or we used ventral shield length. They didn't mention what taxon they used to scale it by. Probably they use something like Costius, but they never say it, and they never say what specimens they measured. They don't provide the measurements they used, and they don't provide the measurements of what specimens of Dunkleosteus they use. They just say, "Oh, we think it's this big based on." Most of them don't even say something. They say, "Oh, it was this long." Well, how do we know it's this long? We don't know it's this long. Um, I very strongly suspect that what happened is they scaled They estimate Dunkleosteus' length based on lower jaw length in Cacosteus because that is a big recognizable feature. And you can, like, if you look at the plates of an Arthrodire in isolation, that is the one that sticks out as being a recognizable anatomical element.
Hmm.
But the thing is, if you actually look at like the proportions between Cacosteus and Dunkleosteus has a much, much bigger jaw. And this actually has like there's precedent for this. Like if you look at modern sharks, and again, I'm using sharks because this is Elasmocast.
Hmm.
A tiger shark has a much bigger mouth and a much bigger jaw, mandibular arch, so much bigger palatal and mechalus cartilage than a dogfish. And if you try to scale a dogfish up to the size, you take a dogfish's mechalus cartilage and scale it up to the size of a tiger shark, you're going to get this massive behemoth of a thing that's probably bigger than a great white. And it's a dogfish, man. Like a tiger shark, a tiger shark looking dogfish is not gonna be looking like that.
Hmm.
Um, so that was a major issue in terms of estimation. And to be fair, the 2017 paper said the exact same thing. They said like, yeah, we could not find any quantitative justification for this size estimate for Dunkleosteus. So that was the thing. Like, I want the problem is if you look at biology, almost everything in biology requires some estimate of body size to be able to do anything. Good example of this, just like the example I just mentioned, the jaw size. So we have a jaw from Cacosteus and we have a jaw of Dunkleosteus. Who has the bigger jaw? Well, you need to scale it by something. And to scale it by something, you need body size. And where do we get that from? Because we don't have the rest of the body. And again, so you mentioned this is something that, like, again, given your audience is shark folks, you probably understand this very well, but the dermal armor of Dunkleosteus is very bony, it preserves well. The rest of the body isn't. And I say cartilage, and I put that with an asterisk by it. It's cartilage, but unlike a shark, there is about a millimeter thick layer of what they call perichondral bone over most of the elements. So usually what happens is that that layer is just destroyed. It's more or less cartilage. It doesn't fossilize. And what we end up finding in the fossil record is a bunch of isolated, often disarticulated and often crushed plates that we don't even know how to put them back. Like we know how to put them back together, but we don't know how to like bend them into the proper orientation. We don't know how to, and there's been papers talk about how to do this, and they're good papers. But the point is, this isn't like a dinosaur where you go out to South Dakota, dig up a T-Rex, and it's more or less looks like a skeleton. There's a lot of reconstruction that's involved in these kind of things.
And
Um,
have we ever found more than just the armored elements of Dunkleosteus?
yes. So there's a couple of the skull cartilages that do preserve at times. There is a specimen that preserves a number of vertebral elements, but it basically stops well before the end of the trunk armor. And these vertebral elements are very weird. When you look at them compared to like say arthrodires that we also like we have vertebral elements from a number of very small, unspecialized like dogfish like arthrodires for lack of a better word. And these don't look like that. Like the basically the entire spine, almost up to the point where it exits the trunk armor, is jammed up and smashed together into the sonarqual, and the whole thing is like heavily fused, heavily remodeled. Like you can still see the sutures between the vertebral elements, so like I've been told the term hyperossified isn't quite the right word because there's still definable elements, but it's gnarled looking. It's bizarre. There are these huge like projections from the side that, like as someone who's worked on tetrapods, they look like the transverse processes of like mammal vertebrae, but apparently they're not. They're apparently like articular facets, like really, really huge articular facets. And that's pretty much all we have of the spinal column. Like if you go into the Cleveland Museum collection, they have bits and chunks of vertebrae here and there, but that's all we have in terms of definable axial elements. There's reports of decent axial material from Morocco, but I mean I haven't seen it, and who knows? Like it could be. I've been I so from what I know, we don't actually have a complete spinal column. If there is, it's undescribed.
Hmm.
Um, but what we also have is we also have the fin girdles. So we actually have a couple. We have at least three specimens that preserve the scapula coracoid and the base of the pectoral fin, and then we have like six or so specimens that actually have part or a decent chunk of the pelvis. And that's basically it in terms of Dunkleosteus. I've been told there is like a possibly lost specimen that may preserve some additional data on like the trunk region. I'm being vague here because I know exactly what it is, but I don't want to. But at the same time, it doesn't actually preserve like the tail or anything. Like we do not have the tail. Like basically anything posterior to the pelvic fins, we do not have.
Hmm. And before we get into the 2024 publications, how big was Dunkleosteus estimated to be prior to your publication, and what has it been shrunk to from it?
So prior to my publication, the estimates for Dunkleosteus were very variable. If you go back to like the 1870s, the estimates range from like 4-ish to 5.5-ish meters. But then you get some like really wacky ones, and it basically after about 1930-ish, all these estimates would say somewhere between 6 to 10 meters. I even saw one study that claimed 12 meters.
Hmm.
Um, the only one that really had quantitative methods claimed it was like, I don't know, 6 to 9 meters. But again, that study is measuring a variable that doesn't really correlate very well with size in arthrodires. What's let's see here, 6 to 9. Probably so the best guess for Dunkleosteus is that typical adults of the species are probably somewhere between like 3.5 to like 3.8 meters, based depending on how much allowance you give for how long the body can be relative to the head. And again, in fishes, the head to body proportions are limited. There's a very limited range of values. And like if even if we assume a higher ratio, like the extremes of what we see in fish, like assuming this thing has a body like a mahi mahi or something, you're
Hmm.
still getting like 3.8 meters. You take Amazicthes, which has an unusually small head compared to the other arthrodires we have body plans for. It's you get a length of like 4 meters for average adults. Now we have some fragments of larger individuals, and I know the paleo world's getting a lot into, oh, how big could these things grow? We just haven't found them. We have a huge sample for dunk. We have a sample for dunk that is at least 6 times greater for T-Rex and possibly more like 7 or 8. Um, Now the thing is, I've looked through a lot of these collections. I've looked through every collection of Dunkleosteus in North America except for one, and that remaining one's not super huge. The biggest chunks we have are suggesting an animal probably about 4 meters long. And again, there's variation based on how long the body could be relative to the head. But even if we assume like the upper ranges of what's possible, again, like assume a weird looking Amazicthes looking body, you get
Hmm.
4.5. That's why I feel relatively confident in saying, based on the data we have right now, you can't get lengths larger than 5 meters for Dunkleosteus. It would either require us to find material that is substantially larger than anything we have currently, or it would require us to find that Dunkleosteus completely disregards almost every scaling relationship we see in arthrodires and fishes more generally.
Hmm. And for people that don't know, if we're talking about meters, multiply that by
Oh, right.
approximately like 3.3 feet. So you're talking like a 4 meter animal would have been around 13 feet long.
Let me double, I'm just double checking here. Yeah, about 13 feet, and like 4.5 is like 15 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's still like a far cry from like what we saw in Chased by Dinosaurs and
Right. I think that one was like 10 meters. So I mean, this is a major issue in that like a lot of researchers just aren't familiar with the normal size range of dunk, because the thing is that like a lot of the placoderm researchers out there, just they're not in North America and they don't work with the Cleveland Museum collections extensively. So the
Mm,
idea of what the normal size range of this thing is not very, like by the same token, like I don't pretend to know what's going on in the back collections of things like with Australian material. There's probably a ton of stuff that's undescribed there, that a lot of interesting stuff. Or like the material for, the Scottish Arthrodires, is probably a ton of stuff that is unseen. But I do know the Cleveland collections fairly well, and I can fairly confidently say that like that's about the limit we're getting from at least the Cleveland material.
mhm. And that kind of brings us over into your one of your most recent publications about, I think it is your most recent because it came out like a little over a week ago
Oh
on
yeah.
on the shape of Dunkleosteus itself. So how has that changed from the prior depictions to now?
Um, So the funny thing is, I was working on both these papers in tandem at the same time. This new publication was originally intended to be in the supplementary information for the 2023 paper,
Hmm.
and so basically about the point it hit 80 pages, it's like, why am I making this supplementary information? Why don't I just make this a separate publication? Especially because there's a saying in paleontology that no one reads the supplementary information, which sadly is kind of true, which is sad because there's a lot of useful information in there. So why not just make this a separate contribution, and it'll get more researchers to look at some of this data I've been seeing in Dunkleosteus. So I did this and I submitted this to Paleo. I've been trying to be consistent in submitting these papers on Dunkleosteus to open access journals, partially so other people can read them without having to do with a paywall, partially to get the public to see some of the stuff and be able to understand it better with Dunkleosteus.
Hmm.
Um, but also because, like you said, Dunkleosteus is a gateway for a lot of things, and Arthrodire literature has almost no introductory texts. Like I had to deal with a very, very sharp learning curve in trying to get into research on the field.
Hmm.
Like there's a volume Denison 1978, which is a big volume of placoderm stuff. It's out of print and it's very, very hard to find. And even then, it's fairly dated, and most of the thing is just a list of species. It's part of the Handbook of Paleotheology series. There's supposed to be a revision coming out, but I mean, I don't know.
Hmm.
The next biggest one I would say is reading like the old Heinz 1932 paper, which is Heinz 1932 is the last big monograph on Dunkleosteus anatomy. There have been papers since then that have been smaller contributions, like, oh, here's one with a pectoral fin. Oh, here's one with a partial spine. Um, there's one talk about reporting stuff from Morocco, but like in terms of getting into the gory details of what this animal looks like and how its anatomy is put together, Heinz, I would say, is like the last major notable landmark. And like part of the reason he didn't go further with this is he got sent to the concentration camps by the Nazis. Now he survived, but he didn't want to do much research after that for understandable reasons. For a variety of reasons, Placoderm, like I would say, I don't want to say Placoderm because there's been a lot of Placoderm studies since then, but Dunkleosteus research specifically pretty much hit a wall between like 1930s, 1940s, and like the 1990s, with the one exception of Lehman 1956 that actually split Dunkleosteus off from Dinichthyes into its own genus. Um, it's very strange. A lot of animals aren't like they don't have these doldrums like that. I don't really have a good explanation for it. Um, shoot, where was I? But so I had all this data, and the idea was, okay, let's try to reconstruct this thing within an inch of its life. Let's go through, because that's the big thing. If you look at at a lot of things, they say, oh, we reconstructed the rest of this anatomy after other arthrodires. And
Hmm.
usually what that translates to is, let's take the anatomy of Cacosteus, slap it on Dunkleosteus, and scale the body size up so like maybe the trunk armor depth equals the trunk armor of Dunkleosteus. So it's basically Cacosteus wearing a Dunkleosteus mask.
Hmm.
And that doesn't work because fishes are incredibly variable in body shape. They're very variable in body shape, even within some clades. So the question is, okay, because again, there's no formal study trying to reconstruct the body shape of Dunkleosteus. The closest you get is there's a few mentions of people justifying how they made the reconstruction, but like the idea of I made the body this long because of X, Y, and Z. I put the fins here because of X, Y, and Z. I made the fins look like this because of X, Y, and Z. There's no extensive treatment. And I thought, well, let's do something different here. So what I did is I did this as well to try to be more of that gateway piece for Arthrodire anatomy that like I wish I had and that like I'm hoping other colleagues will be able to use. I know of several students on Arthrodires who like I'm hoping this will be of use to them. Just so the idea is just go through this and just try to piece it back together. And it's a very weird paper for Arthrodire research because most Arthrodire studies are not interested. There's only limited interest in the trunk armor and almost no interest in anything past the trunk armor because the idea is, well, we have so few things. Like, why are we really talking about this? There's been a few papers since then that have tried to do something different. Like Trinachtik et al. 2015 looked at the pelvic girdles. There's been some papers reporting claspers from arthrodires. There's been some work on the axial skeletons. But like most of what we know about the non-armored portions of arthrodires could it's small. It's a very small bibliography. So
Hmm.
this is like bringing all that together, bringing together new observations, bringing together comparisons with like extant jawed fishes to see like what happens when we apply this stuff to arthrodires, and then just spit the whole thing out and publish it.
Hmm.
So that was the main reason for it. I
So what does Dunkleosteus look like in your depictions? But
um
should get a picture of that up.
oh yeah. So basically one of the biggest thing that hits you about Dunkleosteus when you start looking at it is that it has a much deeper torso than other arthrodires. What's really funny is you look at like the initial assumption was that Dunkleosteus had this greatly shortened trunk armor compared to other arthrodires, but we don't really see any evidence for this. In fact, the problem is like let's look at the armor shape in isolation. The armor shape for Dunkleosteus looks very, very similar to something like, say, Incisoscutum or Cacosteus. It's deeper dorsoventrally rather than shortened. And
Hmm.
again, we can see this because like you can model it and you can probably see that it's doing this, but just visually it's also very evident that like all everything is kind of in the same proportion, with the exception of that very large jaw I mentioned, which again is expected given the differences in ecology. But things are just kind of stretched out top to bottom, suggesting it just has a deeper trunk. And if it didn't, we'd have weird stuff like, oh, because the idea, like assuming like every part of the armor has shrunk at this relative to the body, would require some very weird assumptions, like assuming there's been like it would assume the armor has shrunk as a whole, and there's been absolutely no change in armor proportions, which is very strange. It's even more strange because like people like John Long have even suggested like probably we should expect the armor proportion relative to total length to be consistent across Arthrodire evolution. And like Bob Carr in his review in 1995 explicitly said, yeah, the ratio of armored to unarmored portions of the body doesn't change across Arthrodire evolution. And I calculated a bunch of values for the Arthrodires that we have complete bodies for, like Acosteus and Amazicthes and Caurolepis. And it's like, yeah, Bob was right. They don't actually shrink the armor that much across evolution. They consistently, so I'm not misstating any numbers, I look at like six-ish taxa, and very consistently we see a armor ratio to total body ratio about 45%, I'd say. There's some variation, which is very strange because like some of these classic depictions of Arthrodires have it like being as short as 25 as like 35% or 25%, which is just that's not justifiable based on what we're seeing in the fossils. Like if you have animals that have as diverse body plans of like Holonema, which looks like a nurse shark, Cacosteus, which is like a white-tip reef shark in terms of its overall ecology, Amazicthes, which is like a mackerel,
Hmm.
and they all have the same proportions, that suggests that something's being conserved. Um, so the deep trunk is probably the biggest thing. And the thing is that it's not even, yeah, it has a deep trunk, but it's not even that notable. Like it's notable in the sense that it's deep compared to the other arthrodires, but it doesn't require a dramatically deeper body plan than other fish. Like I report a bunch of what they call fineness ratios for these fishes in the study,
Hmm.
and so if you just look at body depth, the Dunkleosteus specimens come out as being a little strange, but part of that is you're not looking at the total frontal area. Because it turns out, and this is a big issue, so most Dunkleosteus specimens are replicas of one specimen, which is Seaman H 5768. And Seaman H 5768 is, well, do you mind if I do a tangent for a second?
Go for it.
Because it turns out Seaman H 5768 is completely undescribed. Yeah, that famous one you see in museums all over the world is pretty much unrepresented in the literature. There's a few mentions of it here and there. There's like no pictures of it. There's no measurements of it. Um, it's very hard to get data for it until recently, which when I tried to do this with my papers. And part of the reason for this is that I mentioned the last major manuscript on Dunkleosteus in 1932 by Heinz. So he knew about this material. He knew that the Cleveland Museum had this huge sample of Dunkleosteus. He knew they had several mounted heads, and
Hmm.
he deliberately did not consider them in his research. And he says this. He says this specifically, if you don't believe me, I believe page 115. The material in Cleveland, Ohio, gathered under the direction of Professor J.E. Hyde, is the most perfect collection of Arthrodira I know. However, since it's going to be included in a monograph by Professor Hyde, nothing I saw in Cleveland is included in this work. I might only mention here, however, that in spite of Professor Hyde's far superior material, and in spite of some new plates of Dinichthyes he has found, the description given in this paper perfectly correlate with the new material in Cleveland. And Jesse Hyde never published any of this. Jesse Hyde was very involved in outreach. Um, so he was very big. He did this big thing where he during the Great Depression he organized youth groups to go out to Cleveland Shale and collect every scrap of bone they found. And that's part of the reason the Cleveland collections are so huge. So, but the thing is, he was so busy and had so many different things, he never actually published any of the papers he intended to do in the Cleveland Shale. I've actually read the guy's obituary, and his friends lamented that he was such a perfectionist that they would beg him, please publish something, put a preliminary paper out, do something. And Jesse Hyde would say, no, it has to be perfect. We just need one more season of field collecting. It'll be great. And Hyde ended up, he contracted an illness in the later years of his life. And he even said, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I should have just published. It's too late for me now. Um, so again, so people are making these conclusions on Dunkleosteus and there's not even depictions of them in the literature. With CUNH 5768 specifically, there's an issue in that if you take a look at it, all the side plates of the chest armor are reconstructed. And it's very hard to see because in most of these reconstructions, usually like if you are replacing a bone with a cast, they paint it white or something very obvious to tell. The Cleveland Museum reconstructions basically had their bones textured differently, but not colored differently. So if you're looking at them, you can't tell the difference. And the problem is, so the thing is, if you look at CMH5768, the body shape is circular in cross section. But if you go and you look at there's a couple specimens down in the museum that aren't on display that have the complete trunk armor. They're ovate. They're actually, I will get the appendix up. So this is a measure of body depth versus body width in various taxa. They're color coded by major clade. This dotted line here is a length to width trunk ratio of 1. And that usually, so like you can see here, sharks have a relatively cylindrical torso. Um, some of these, like I think these are guitarfish down here that are super flat. I'm not sure what these are up here. I think there's like certain taxa that have a little bit deeper body. Um, some of these may actually be measurement errors because they are measurements of specimens like captured in the field. So like if you have a shark laying on its side, it may look deeper than it may otherwise be.
Hmm.
Um, but like Cacosiomorph arthrodires, which are these generalized early brachythoracids, they're like sharks. They have a cylindrical body.
Hmm.
Over here, we have the teleosts, and they have, on average, a body depth body width ratio of like 2. So, on average, the body is twice as deep as it is wide. And there are some that are much more extreme than this. Like, look at a herring. A herring is like body width to body depth ratio of like 4. But now we go to the arthrodires, and it turns out that Dunkleosteus, so these specimens that are complete, we have a complete body armor for, they seem to have body armors that have a body depth to body width ratio of like 1.25, which is narrower than sharks, but not as narrow as teleost fish. And what's funny is some of these reconstructions you see with other Cleveland shell arthrodires or like some of these arthrodires from other parts of the world from the latest Devonian, they do seem to have this intermediate kind of weird body proportion. Now the funny thing is, like there are fish that have this. Tunas have have a body shape like this, but that's because tunas have secondarily become fat, chunky things from this narrow teleost condition.
Hmm.
So non-teleost actinopterygians are like this. Like garfish are like this. Paddlefish are like this. Like they're narrower, but they're not like super skinny and compressed like a teleost is. And catfishes are kind of this big outlier. They're a lot more rounded. They're actually catfishes have this very strangely shark-like body plan in a lot of aspects in terms of like where the parts are arranged and like what the shape of the body looks like. Because they don't look like a teleost. They're not narrow, compressed, skinny fish. They're much chunkier animals. Um, but if you take that into account, Dunkleosteus ends up having a frontal area fineness ratio that's not that different from other fish. Like it's comparable to things like groupers, snappers, and tuna. And the thing is, you can do this with the other arthrodires, and you can do this with ones that we have complete bodies for, and you can do this with ones that we can approximate to some degree. With the exception of one group, which are the chimeropisids, which are really skinny looking arthrodires, have really skinny armor, and some are much more extreme than this. With the exception of this group, modern arthrodires actually are considered below average among fishes in terms of their fineness ratio. Now they're not some massive outlier. It's just that they plot in the same general area as like stock fish that you'd consider squat bodied, like tuna, like groupers, like things that are just kind of heavy set fish. They do not have a shark like body plan. Um, so the average fineness ratio for fishes is about 4.6. Arthrodires, with the exception, every arthrodire has a ratio below that, with the exception of these chimeropisids. Like Amazictes, it has a ratio of like 4. Maybe it's a bit lower because it probably has a narrower body than I was using to calculate, so it may get up to like that average.
Hmm.
The average shark has a fineness ratio of like 6. Like that is significantly narrower than like any arthrodire. And you can just look at these things and see that.
Hmm.
Um, but that does kind of get into this broader conclusion that, I mean, the research gets to, which is that arthrodires are not sharks. we should not be simply taking a shark body plan and uncritically slapping an Arthrodira and calling it a day. Like these are distinct animals. And like I mentioned before with the Eubrachithoracids, the Eubrachithoracids seem to have actually evolved active swimming habits independently of sharks. So
Mhm.
it's pretty likely that they're going to have some different solutions to some of these challenges faced by animals moving out into open ocean, or not open ocean, but just active swimming habitats. And some of that's going to be driven by the fact that these things have armor over their body. I mean, what shark has armor over its body? I mean, you can say Shinnicanthus, but like even then, these sharks are losing their armor very early, and you see papers saying like, yeah, this is a shark thing. They ditch any kind of dermal bone and make their bodies super lightweight so they can do things.
And it's very possible that they haven't shared a common ancestor since somewhere in the Ordovician, like
Oh
farther.
yeah.
So,
And the thing is, that common ancestor was probably most likely based on what we're seeing with like these placoderms. It's probably some kind of largely benthic animal that doesn't have a lot of adaptations for active swimming habits.
mhm,
So they're probably doing some things differently. There's going to be some convergences, but not like a huge amount of convergences. I mean, yes and no. There are some features when we compare them to sharks, like, oh, this is just what sharks do. This is the same thing. We can apply it pretty easily. But by the same token, what is it? But by the same token, you see a lot of things that like are not shark-like at all. Like
mhm.
not just this research, a bunch of other stuff you can see is just not shark-like. Um, I'm just trying to think if there's any. I mean, like, I mean, the paper is a good enough example of that. I don't think I need to get into other like unpublished stuff.
Mhm. So yeah, with how small well, not it's still not a small animal, but the
No,
much
it's
smaller Dunkleosteus. So in the Devonian, would there have been an animal that would have been larger than Dunkleosteus or at a higher trophic level that was
probably
max?
not. So there's an asterisk to that, but like I would say we don't have any good evidence right now for an animal significantly larger than Dunkleosteus in the Devonian. I went through and checked these things. I checked all the big sarcopterygians we have. I checked some of the Carboniferous coelacanths to see how big they're getting relative to Dunkleosteus. And they may get a little bit bigger, but I mean, I think the jury's still out on a lot of the sizes for the Carboniferous stuff, and like I'm limiting how much I'd speak on that. But for the Devonian at least we seem to consistently see these large predatory fishes topping out at around like 4.5 meters. And that's a
Mm,
little bit generous, assuming we've like some are bigger than we found, or maybe the body of dunk is a little bit longer than we found. But like they don't seem to actually get to the size of like the largest great white sharks we have today. They don't get anywhere near like an orca size at all. Now I would say one exception to this is Titanichthys, and the reason is that our sample size for Titanichthys is terrible. Titanichthys is the second most common arthrodire in the Cleveland Shale. They find it in Morocco. But the big problem you run into is Titanichthys is characterized by this super thin, super fragile bone compared to other arthrodires. So while you can identify Titanichthys fossils rather easily in the field, saying what part of the body they come from is almost impossible, unless you have like the intrognathal or you have something that's identifiable. Um, so based on what I've seen, and there's a big caveat to that, based on what I've seen, Titanichthys seems to reach sizes similar to Dunkleosteus. Maybe a little larger, I don't know. Like the biggest Titanichthys specimen we have, which is this specimen at the American Museum of Natural History, has a head that's about the same size as the expected head size for the very largest Dunkleosteus specimens we have. Maybe. And then you got to consider that, like, if you look at a whale sharks have huge heads. If you're a filter feeding animal is going to have a huge head and a huge gill chamber because it's a filter feeder and that's how it eats. It needs a huge mouth to take in water and then filter over the gills and then spit it out the other end. And the bigger the mouth is, the better that works. And the bigger the head is, the bigger that works. So you get these huge gill chamber regions. Um, I'm not very confident about the estimates for Titanichthys. In the sense of like, I don't think it's going to turn out like, oh, Titanichthys is actually 6 meters, but like, I think there's a lot more caveats with Titanichthys because of the smaller sample size.
mhm.
I would not be surprised based on the fact that we see a lot of faunas where, like, a whale shark dwarfs a great white. I would not be surprised if we found a 5 meter Titanichthys one day. There's stories, apparently in Janvier in 1996, there's stories about how when Titanichthys fossils were originally found in Morocco, The paleontologists who found them mistook them for dinosaur bones until they realized they were in the Devonian. Now,
Mm,
granted, I mean, these arthropods have very thick bones, and a small arthropod can get mistaken for a decent sized dinosaur if you look at the wrong part. But maybe there's a bigger Titanic out in Morocco. I don't know. Based on the Cleveland stuff, I would say it probably wouldn't be dramatically larger, but it would be enough that might push it over the 5 meter limit. But I just we just don't see colossal megafauna in the Devonian.
hmm And John
Um,
Long, in his book, I did a podcast with him. He was the last Elasmocast guest, and he talks about these very large Devonian tenacants. But are those species, or is that animal described formally?
no, actually, I and some co-authors. This is a specimen that's been floating around. This is one of Hyde's specimens that was collected back in the 1920s or so.
Hmm
And some co-authors and I are looking into describing this thing, maybe doing some size estimations, maybe doing stuff like that, like formally getting this thing into the literature.
hmm
I've looked at the specimen, I've worked with the specimen. I had to do a preliminary size estimate for it in order to talk about this in my 2023 paper, because if I'm saying, I don't think there's any 5 meter long predatory vertebrates in the Devonian, and someone says, well, what about this? What about sharks? How big do they get? I have to touch on that in some way. I
hmm
really want to try to estimate this thing with a bit more rigor. I have some ideas how to do that, but I just gave a very, what I did is, so these coelacanths, we have several coelacanths with complete bodies. We have Dracopristis and we have Goodrichthyes.
hmm
And the proportions of the elements in Goodrichthyes uh, that are, so we have like jaw cartilage from these big coelacanths. The ratio of these preserved elements that we have to scale off of, because it's all we got in this big coelacanth, relative to body size in basically all the other coelacanths we have is the same. It's about 16% total length.
hmm
So if we know, for example, this jaw is, let's say the jaw is like 68 centimeters long. So it's a very simple matter of 68 divided by 0.16. That's the same thing as divided by 16%.
hmm
That gets you a body length of like 4.2 meters. Now, I want to look at this in much more detail, be much more rigorous, maybe like look into why this is, like what this says about stuff like that. But again, like I have some other metrics of trying this, and it again repeatedly gets things like 4.2 meters. Like
Yeah.
that is probably pretty close. Like we're talking error that's like less than maybe 30 centimeters in either direction in terms of what we're getting.
hmm
I 5 to 6 meters for Devonian coelacanths is probably not justifiable.
And for people that don't know what a coelacanth is, those are one of the cladodontomorph orders. So they have those typical cladodont tooth designs, which when you think of a Paleozoic shark tooth, they're not true sharks, but their phylogeny is up for debate. But anyways, they have that really tall lingual protuberance on their root. So they have a flat basal face on their tooth base. Root isn't the best word for describing this part of a tooth, so we tend to like to use tooth base. But anyways, they have that. They have a long median cusp and then lateral cusplets as well, and that's basically that cladodont tooth design. And these were one of the predominant macropredatory chondrichthyans throughout the Paleozoic. So we had the two main groups of these macropredatory chondrichthyans would have been the Ctenacanthiforms and the Eugenodontiforms. But anyways, would that have shrunk some of the longly considered orca-sized chondrichthyans such as Cyvotus as well, which was also a Ctenacanth?
I
Because
wouldn't
those
be
have been considered to be like the Ctenacanth as far as size goes.
I wouldn't be surprised, but like I don't really know how big that material is. Like maybe it's significantly larger than the Cleveland material. I can't really say. I think there are some cases where the coelacanth sharks are somewhat overestimated, like not just in regards to like Cyvidus. Like this is something I ran into when I was looking at sizes for this recent body size paper that came out. Like for example, the Texas super shark. when calculating the links in that, it turns out there's actually a lapsus in the calculations. It's assuming that the brain case length of these coelacanths relative to total length, it assumes that like it wasn't Dracopristis. It assumed that the body length of Dracopristis was 2.5 meters, and and that was a preliminary report, and it turned out to be 2 meters.
Hmm.
And what that means is that that easily chops a meter off that shark. Um, Maybe there's something else going on there that like I don't know that would make it that size, but like when I tried to replicate the links by, measuring off of the reported data from Dracopristis, I did get shorter lengths.
Hmm. Interesting. But yeah,
I think one of the big problems is like we just don't know what the size variation of coelacanths is, and we don't know how they scale very well to other sharks. Like again, that's something I am very interested in doing is providing a more rigorous way to do this because I mean placoderms are great, but these eubrachythoracids were only around for like 30 to 50 million years. The Arthrodires go back as a whole, go back a little bit further, but these Dunkleosteus like things aren't around for a huge span of time. Coelacanths go all the way from the late Devonian, like well into almost like what up to the Permo-Triassic boundary. And
mhm,
this is something that's a lot more important to get a handle on because like you said, these and the Eugeniodonts are the largest vertebrates on Earth probably about this time. So like how big do they get? What is that? And that says a lot about like the ecosystems. Like, are they, what's their trophic level? Like, what are they eating? Because like a big shark has to eat food that's so big relative to its body size, or else it can't feed itself.
mhm,
Um, and then there's other questions like I've seen questions about like there's been suggestions of abiotic variables producing gigantism in various carboniferous groups. McGee's book, which he talks about this. It's a pop science book, so take it with a grain of salt. But he talks about like, how like was there gigantism in marine invertebrates? Which he argues yes. I'm not an invertebrate guy, so I don't have an opinion either way. But the question is, if that's the case, do we see similar changes in body size across these animals? When we talk about something like, the late Paleozoic Ice Age, like in they talk about how megalodon, got huge because whales were getting bigger and that provided a food source. But part of the reason the whales were getting bigger is because the oceans were getting colder and they could support more things. Do we see that with sharks in the Paleozoic? Is that a thing that we have because whales are around, or is that a thing that is unique to the Cenozoic, or is it present in the Paleozoic too? We don't know. It would be an interesting question to test, but we don't know.
And one
Um,
of the really fascinating genera that is not often talked about and is not really well known by the mainstream media, but I've heard paleontologists talk about, reaching near whale shark sizes is Erodus.
So I am basically going to default to what Zangrel said because Zangrel is the one who mentioned these large teeth and what kind of animal that would have to go to. So the thing is, yeah, he said if you scale these teeth 1 to 1, you do get a 12-meter shark. But he also, because I mean, I'm assuming your listeners may know this. Zangrel was very famous. He worked at the Mecha Shale Quarry, which is a black shale quarry in Indiana. Produced all these complete body fossils of Carboniferous chondrichthyans of all different types. Like it's produced one of the only complete bodies of a Eugeniodont that we know of, which would be Romarodus. He said he looked like crazy for very large shark remains, and he didn't even find scraps of cartilage that would suggest a huge 12-meter animal.
Mhm.
Um, Now, granted, you could argue, well, maybe the water was shallow, you didn't get a huge animal coming in there, but like it's kind of suggestive. And Zangerl himself didn't really consider these estimates of like 10 to 12 meters reasonable. Um, I think there's some questions as well as like with Orotus. Do we like a lot of things, very few things in biology scale isometrically. That's part of what was important about my dunk study because the variable I identified is near isometric, which means it correlates very strongly with body size, regardless of what size you're at.
Mhm.
If you're looking at many variables, unless you test for isometry or isometry versus allometry, you often run into very, very screwy results where people end up overestimating things just based on, because things don't scale linearly in a lot of animals. Uh, just as an example, like in a lot of groups, like head size doesn't scale linearly. In fishes, it does, but like if you look at like certain crocodiles, it doesn't. Or maybe it does because there's some issues in crocodiles with looking at ontogenetic trends versus species specific, like differences between species.
Hmm.
Um, I know, like in some of these crocodiles specifically, they've talked about how, yeah, they've taken some vertebrae from crocodiles, they've tried scaling them up to huge sizes. But then it turns out that, like, and they've done this with dinosaurs too, and then it turns out that, like, vertebrae in general across a lot of these vertebrates are probably positively allometric, which means a bigger vertebrae correlates to a proportionally smaller animal, which makes sense because if you're a big animal, you need a proportionally bigger and tougher skeleton to support that weight on land. Whether that does the same thing in marine vertebrates, I don't know. But this is the question: is like, do we know that these things are isometric? How can we even test these scaling patterns? How do we even know that any of these scaling patterns are reliable? I mean, like Oritus, how do we know that like the big Oritus don't have proportionally larger teeth to their body size? And then you get into issues like what is it? Is it Elliott et al. 2004? Let me check. Yeah, it's Elliott et al. Where is it? Yeah. So Elliott et al. 2004 basically argued that Oridus maybe is a polyphyletic assemblage of sharks that happen to be specialized for crushing things. And maybe they're a bunch of different lineages, like maybe one's related to tenacants, maybe one's a stem holocephalian, maybe like who knows?
Yeah.
But if that's the
I do
case,
tend to follow that interpretation. So what I was going to say was that you see in even some publications that are fairly recent, you'd see teeth described as erotus or in quotations erotus, but they have like eugenodontiform traits, for example, like where the crown protrude, it has these like protrusions on it that stick out from like towards the base on both sides. And that's a very eugenodont trait that you see in like things like Cassiotis, Agassiz, things like that.
man, I hadn't heard. That's very interesting. Um, But I mean, that's the bigger thing. You say we have these 1 centimeter long teeth that are assigned to Orodes, and if you're just listening to this, I'm air quoting as hard as I can. So what's the chance? Like, do we know these materials belong to the same type of shark as like Orodes micropterygius, or are they something like are they something else? Are they like some kind of crushing eugenodont? I mean, I talk to a lot of shark researchers and they talk about things like how a lot of these older specimens that maybe do this are lost or hard to find. Like, so it's like with Petalotus, like supposedly the holotype is lost. I know people who are trying to like look for more documentation on it, but like that's a big issue for Paleozoic shark research because, everything has to go back to comparisons with that holotype.
Hmm. Yeah, that is true. And let's talk a little bit about that other publication that came out recently, because you talk about the sizes, you and your co-authors talk about the sizes of Perucetus, Megalodon, Dunkleosteus, which we've already covered in depth, and Helicoprion, which is one of those massive eugenodonts. So let's talk a little bit about Helicoprion first.
Well, what do you want to know?
Let's just talk about your synopsis of Helicoprion in that publication.
So with those four case studies, the authors divided up among the people who tended to work on each taxon. So I provide the Dunkleosteus paragraph. Gayford, Shimada, and Stearns did most of the Megalodon stuff, and Wayne Natano did a big chunk of the Helicoprion stuff. And he talked about how one of the major issues is beyond where the world is placed, what does that mean for not head size, but body size in this animal? And I think the broader thing he got into is there's been some estimates of body size in this thing, but even then, it's not really clear how big these animals get. I've seen different estimates, and a lot of these estimates depend very, very heavily on whether or not you're inferring like an elasmobranch like body plan versus like a holocephalian one. And I'm not talking about necessarily like, a ratfish. I'm
Hmm.
talking about more like, what happens if you try to scale these animals based on, we have other eugenodonts. What happens if you try to scale it based on them? And you get very different results depending on what you get. Um, Now, which of those are more reliable? Like, who knows? Maybe the giant eugenodonts, the eudestoids and stuff have very, very different body plans than the small ones. But I mean, that happened with Dunkleosteus, and that is a very, a lot of assumptions to go down that road. Um, I honestly could not speak which like with like what I would consider reliable estimates for Helicoprion. I have thoughts on this, but like they're not well developed thoughts, and I'd hate to, step my foot in something I don't know a ton about
Yeah.
firsthand.
Yeah, I understand. And I've heard estimates from paleontologists about like the 30 to 40-foot range for the largest ones. But again, it's tough to say, especially with all of these recent findings of overestimates in paleontology, whereas there's not a ton of, underestimating relatively.
Yeah, so that was the issue is so when we reviewed this, the reviewers basically said, "Well, how can you say this is a broader problem? Like, what are examples?" So it's like, okay, let's give examples. So what we did is we searched the literature, and I want to stress this very heavily. We did not look very hard. What we basically did is we took what we knew, we took what we knew other researchers had mentioned to us were controversial because, like, for me, for example, after I did my Dunkleosteus study, I had many researchers come up to me and said, "Yeah, we kind of think that we have a similar problem with our group too." Um, I looked at the literature, looked through things that like I mostly my co-authors and I, what we tried to do are we tried to focus on things that had distinct published rebuttals or some kind of thing to actually suggest there was a controversy.
Hmm.
In a couple cases, we had to like re-estimate sizes on our own because there were things that we had been told might have been controversial, or they're in a group that we work on that we knew are kind of not right, and so we had to figure it out on our own. But like most of them are just we're just citing the previously published literature. Like this is just citing previous work.
Hmm.
And what we basically found are there were like 50 to 55 cases of overestimation of body size in charismatic extinct megafauna. This is an undercount because we grouped a bunch of morphologically similar taxa together just for the sake of convenience because they often revolve around the similar discussions. Like, for example, we grouped the South American caimans together because they're kind of the similar methods have been used on them. We grouped mosasaurs together because they've almost all been estimated using similar methods. We
Hmm.
grouped belosaurs together because there's a big study that just talks about size estimation in a belosaurus period. But like a good example of this is the big pterosaurs. We have like two or three big pterosaur genera. We have Aramborgiana, we have Quetzalcoatlus, and we have Hatzegopteryx, and a few other big ones. The problem is the size of things like Aramborgiana and Hatzegopteryx have almost exclusively been estimated by comparing this thing to Quetzalcoatlus, which is the most complete giant pterosaur we have, but it's also like a part like a partial wing, some other vertebral, some other arm fragments. There are some neck vertebrae, and I think there's like some chunks of one of the legs. There was a huge monograph about this that got published in like the last 2 years in Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology that talked about this is what we have of the big Quetzalcoatlus. Now,
Hmm.
there's a smaller species, Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, that we have better remains for, but the big one, Quetzalcoatlus northropi, we only have a few specimens. And basically, if you're trying to estimate the body size of these pterosaurs, it almost invariably comes back to we're scaling against this Quetzalcoatlus northropi material. So that's why we treat it all as one. But if you counted them separately, you'd get up to like maybe 60 or more separate cases of overestimation. Now, underestimation. We found five-ish cases of significant underestimation in paleontology. And these are two marsupials, Diprotodon thylacoleo, pterygotus, which is a borderline case because it like only gained like 20 centimeters, and that was because of the change in outgroup from what they were scaling it from, which isn't even that big of a change. It's just the upper ends of what was estimated before.
Hmm.
Megalodon, which that depends very heavily on how you interpret the results of Stearns et al. 2024, and Metriorhynchidae, which was a straight up case of yeah, these things were underestimated. They were estimated to be like 4 meters, like Dacosaurus was estimated to be 4 meters, and it's probably like 5.5 based on this analysis that was performed.
Hmm.
Um, but the thing is, you never, other than those cases, you almost never saw size estimates for extinct taxa go up unless they found larger material of what than what was previously known. A good example of this is T-Rex. T-Rex, we had a bunch of specimens for years, and then they found things like Sue and Scotty that are like, I don't know, 5 to 10% larger than, like the holotype or the specimens at, Carnegie and such. And that bumped up the size a little bit. But that is new material. This isn't like going back to an old specimen. Like we have yet to see, except for that Metro-Rinkin study. I guess the Metro-Rinkin study of the two marsupials, we don't really see studies where someone goes back, looks at pre-existing material and says, "Oops, we underestimated this. This needs to be a lot larger than we previously thought."
Hmm.
And it's this one-sidedness of the pattern which suggests that this isn't just random. Like if you're estimating the size of extinct taxa, you're going to have big problems with like fragmentary material, and you don't know like unknown unknowns.
Hmm.
Um, like if you're trying to estimate based on like a jaw, there are so many things that could be funky about that, and you have to work with what you have. But the fact that like what you'd expect is, if you're throwing darts at a wall with regards to size estimates, or these are things that it's uncontrollable random error, you'd expect a systematic pattern, or not systematic, you expect random variation. You'd expect like half them to be underestimates and half them to be overestimates.
Hmm.
Given that, let me just crunch the numbers here. Given that 90% of these cases are overestimates and not underestimates, suggests that we have a systematic issue with regards to body size estimation.
Mm. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, though, I mean, there's a ton of things it could be. I honestly think the broader pattern here is more of a case of unfamiliarity with potential sources of error with size estimation, more than anything else.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of these studies, like it's almost like clockwork. The things that almost guarantee that something was going to go wrong reading the methods are pre-existing assumption of isometry, because positive allometry, it turns out, is very rampant in these giant animals. Extrapolation error, which is a big issue. And you had this consistent issue of certain variables that were used tended to not be the most reliable in terms of estimating size. One of which is like skull length, because they would assume, oh, just scale the skull isometrically. And it turns out that's in a lot of groups, it turns out that skull length seems to scale with positive allometry, which, I mean, you can kind of see this in like, like let's say dinosaurs. Like T-Rex has a much bigger head than Deinonychus.
Hmm.
There is variation in that, but in general, there's a trend towards bigger meating dinosaurs having a big head relative to the body. And that seems to be the case with a lot of these groups, is they have big heads relative to the body at larger sizes. Um, but that's the thing, is it's the selection of scaling variables that probably scale with positive allometry. Um, and just like not testing if these assumptions of this is a useful scaling variable is accurate. I mean that's the first thing that people need to do with these things is you have a scaling variable, and then you have some case that you can apply it to, and then you see if it works out. Like that's what I did with Dunkleosteus. So I needed something, and I said, well, if it works on Cacosteus, or sorry, if it does not work on Cacosteus, the chances of it working on Dunkleosteus are super low. But if it works, now we don't know for sure because we don't have a tail for Dunkleosteus, but the odds of it working for Dunkleosteus go way up.
Hmm. Yeah, it's all interesting. So before we wrap up the podcast, I want to ask you, what is one thing that you want to find out or discover within your lifetime paleontologically?
I would say finding a relatively complete Dunkleosteus specimen. I would love to, work on something like that. Just to actually get a firm idea of what it looks like. Um, I mean, but that's kind of a low hanging fruit. I would love to find a better specimen of Gorgonichthyes as well, just because the remains of that are so limited. Like it would be very nice to find bigger things of not bigger things, but more complete things of Gorgonichthyes.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. In general, like I try not to daydream about like, I would love to find the bones of Godzilla. It's like, well, you could, but my life experiences have taught me to be very pragmatic about, what I want to do. Like dream, but dream about things that you think you can actually do.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'd say in terms of discovering fossils, that's probably what I'd want to do most is, I get that's probably a cheap answer, but it is an answer.
Well, I mean, it's your answer, so
Yeah,
I would say that Dunkleosteus finding a complete one of those would be one of the top ones for most people that are into the Paleozoic world of stuff.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was great having you on. Take care. And for those that enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff. And yeah, thanks for tuning into Elasmocast. And thank you for joining us, Russell.
You're welcome.